Welcome to the eBay Research Seminar. I am thrilled to introduce Dennis Rodgers, who is Professor in Anthropology at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies at Geneva. He is a world expert on gangs. He's probably the world expert on gangs in Nicaragua. So we're very, very privileged to have him here today talking to us about gang rules towards a political economy of gangland violence in Nicaragua. And I believe this is linked to his bigger research project, an ERC-funded project, comparative ethnography of gangs, gangsters, and ganglands. So, welcome, Dennis. And we have until about 3 o'clock, probably 30 or 40 minutes for the presentation and then Q&A, however it works. Yeah.
Great. No, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's delightful to be here. I was just saying, I think I came to eBay to give a talk already about gangs about 10 years ago. This is not the same talk. It has changed quite substantially. Yes, so this project, this kind of presentation in some ways is kind of, it is partly linked to my ERC project, but it's actually more of a kind of overview of kind of longitudinal trajectory of gangs in Nicaragua. So it's kind of in some ways synthesizing 25 years of ethnographic research. Now, perhaps let me begin by trying to explain why gangs are an interesting phenomenon to think about. At one level, gangs are an inherently revealing, they're inherently revealing social institutions. As Frederick Thrasher, the granddaddy of kind of gang research, once put it in his pioneering study of the phenomenon in 1920s Chicago, they are in many ways life, rough and untamed, rich in elemental social processes significant to the fusion of society and human nature. And gangs are associable with a variety of fundamental human activities, such as the exercise of power, capital accumulation, socialization, identity formation, territorial control, or the articulation of gender relations. And these kinds of processes are arguably observable in a more direct manner through the gang lens, to the extent that you could argue that gangs are particularly insightful bellwether institutions through which you can understand broader social processes and broader contexts, all the more so as gangs are a global social phenomenon. They're one of the very few phenomena that you can find in some form or another across all societies, across the planet, and across time and space. Now, the first systematic studies of gangs began about 100 years ago, and there have been many insightful studies of the phenomena, including by people in this room, such as Carlos Pesha over here, who has the other gang ERC project. Now, these studies have highlighted how there's a variety of forms and logics and consequences associable with gangs. Now, at the same time, a lot of gang research, and here Carlos is not included in the ones that I'm about to criticize, has focused on refining the taxonomy of the phenomenon. They propose different forms of classification, saying this is a gang because it has X number of members, or because it's involved in this kind of activity, and so on. And as the critical gang researcher John Hagedorn has pointed out, this kind of nitpicking categorization actually provides very little in the way of insights into kind of the dynamics of accounting for the emergence, the decline, the spread, and the evolution of gangs. Now, part of the problem is also that most studies of gangs tend to be very synchronic rather than diachronic in nature. They kind of tend to provide these kind of temporally limited snapshots of the phenomena. Now, part of this is for very understandable reasons. Approaching a gang and kind of studying a gang is not necessarily easy. And so often you have an opportunity which is limited in time, and therefore you will only see the gang in that kind of in that moment. Yet, you could argue that only a longitudinal perspective can properly allow for an understanding of how gangs emerge, decline, spread, and change. But what my presentation today will do is draw on my ongoing longitudinal research on gang dynamics in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, a poor neighborhood in Managua, the capital city of Nicaragua, where I've been carrying out ethnographic investigations since 1996, in order to try to identify some potential useful elements towards understanding the evolution of gangs and gang transformation. So this is very much kind of a preliminary ideas about trying to see, can we identify certain constant trends within a kind of trajectory, certain repeated processes of evolution, or identify others which are very contingent on kind of particular moments and so on. I'm going to begin by briefly situating gangs within Nicaragua's developmental trajectory, before then offering some methodological reflections about my research. And then I'm going to briefly describe successive incarnations of the gang that emerged in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández over the past 30 years, in order to identify conceptual and empirical building blocks relating to the underlying nature of what I'm calling gangland violence, or in other words, what we might call gang rules. I'm particularly going to be analyzing the gang rules through an application of Bourdieusian theory, conceptualizing the Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang as a social field within which individual forms or different forms of individual and collective capital accumulation emerge and interact with each other variably. Now, Nicaragua, for those of you whose geography is a bit shaky, is in the Western Hemisphere. It is between the US there and the kind of the rest of South America. It's a kind of small country, about 6 million inhabitants, although it's quite large in Central America in terms of landmass. It's probably most known for the Sandinista revolution of the 1970s and 80s, an inspiring moment for many of us, but which unfortunately is now very much a history, and the kind of, although the Sandinistas are back in power, they're very much a kind of parody of what they once were. Now, gangs or pandillas have long been a feature of Nicaraguan society. Their origins can be traced back to the kind of country's rapid urbanization in the middle of the 20th century, in some way very similar to the origins of gangs all around the world. These first gangs in Nicaragua were spontaneous groups of youth that emerged very organically in urban squatter settlements, defending them against eviction. And they tended to last only as long as the peer group underpinning them stayed together. They were clearly not a very prominent feature of Nicaraguan society in the kind of 60s and 70s. For example, they're not mentioned at all in Reynaldo de Vélez's seminal study of urban poverty in Nicaragua. And the Sandinista insurrection of the late 70s, followed by the revolutionary regime war against the US-backed Contras in the 80s, led to a kind of marked decline in the gang phenomena. During the insurrectionary period, this was because the sociological space of the gang, the street, was occupied by more powerful actors, the Sandinista guerrillas and the dictator Somoza's National Guard. And during the war, this was principally due to the fact that the revolutionary government introduced a universal military service with an age of conscription of 16. But also because in many parts of the country, particularly in the cities, they developed grassroots forms of organization, which were one of the major hallmarks of the revolutionary era. That included things like neighbourhood vigilance, youth brigades, and so on, which basically also blocked the space, the physical space within which gangs kind of could emerge. Gangs began to reappear in Nicaragua in the late 1980s due to the war-fueled erosion of the Sandinista welfare state, declining levels of local organization, decreasing legitimacy of the revolutionary regime, and increasing numbers of youth deserting their military service. Now, these new gangs principally involved groups of young men, although female gang members are not unknown in Nicaragua, and I will talk a bit about a particular moment in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández where a female gang emerged. They are not the norm. Most gang members in Nicaragua are young men. Now, this first kind of wave of gangs in the kind of late 1980s and early 1990s were young men who'd often been conscripted together and who joined forces to protect their families and friends from the rising crime and insecurity that became one of the hallmarks of early 1990s Nicaragua. In some ways, you could argue, displayed a vigilante ethos not that dissimilar from the groups who came to the fore in urban squatter settlements to protect kind of communities from eviction in the 60s and 70s. Now, regime change in 1990, the dismantling of Sandinismo, implementation of neoliberal policies, saw the spread of gangs accelerate, and they became a prominent feature of poor urban communities in Nicaragua in the 90s. Now, although obviously associated with various forms of crime and delinquency that had significantly negative consequences, gangs at the same time arguably became the primary institutional vector for the structuring and organizing of social life in many poor urban communities in Nicaragua. And it is this, more than anything else, that makes them socially significant. At the same time, the nature of this gang rule has changed over time for both endogenous as well as exogenous reasons, including internal gang transformations, as well as the fact that the Nicaraguan state has changed and new articulations of state and society have emerged. Understanding the reasons for the transformation of gangs and the social order that they promulgate is a critical question, but one that can only be understood from a longitudinal perspective. And so what I want to do is to offer you now this kind of 30-year perspective. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour in order to kind of stay within kind of the 45-minute frame. And as I said, in some ways, this is a summary of kind of 25 years of research. It's a little bit depressing to do because you kind of suddenly think that you can summarize. And then you'll see there's a slide a bit later on where there's a table which summarizes it all. And when I finished that table, I just thought, I just summarized 25 years of work in a single page. Now, perhaps, you know, brevity is something good, but sometimes too much brevity is not good. Before, though, I give you this whistle-stop tour, let me offer you a few reflections about my research methods. Now, the empirical materials I'm going to present to you, as I said, draw on 25 years of ethnographic research in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández. And this is a neighborhood which I have kind of spent extended periods of time on a regular basis. I followed the evolution of the gang, exploring the dynamic of its mutation. In practical terms, this has involved 9 bouts of ethnographic fieldwork, totaling 24 months, over 1996-97, 2002, 2002-2003, 2007, 2009, 2012, 14, 16, and most recently in February 2020. I was supposed to have another bout of fieldwork last year, but unfortunately the pandemic paid for that. I'm hoping to be able to get back in 2023. Now, during this fieldwork, I have engaged in a mix of participant observation, in-depth interviewing, both one-off and repeatedly with the same individuals over an extended period of time, as well as conducted mapping exercises and focus groups. I've also carried out a household survey of barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, and I have repeatedly photo-documented its infrastructural transformation over time. I've also researched issues beyond gang dynamics, including poverty, gender relations, labor, migration, remittances, history, memory, urban development, informal economic activity, politics, and spatiality. Now, obviously, the way I've done fieldwork has evolved over time, partly because I've evolved over time. As you can see, these are photos. The first, top one on the left is me, let's say, 24 years ago. So, no, even more than 26 years ago. I have changed a little bit, as you can see, and the one at the bottom is in February 2020. I think you could summarize the evolution of my ethnographic research as being one of lesser activity. Initially, I would perhaps run around a lot with the gang, spend nights with them and so on. Now it's much more hanging out on street corners and kind of talking to them and doing them and so on. So perhaps less participation and more observation. But in some ways, I think this is a natural process which kind of links to the evolution of aging. Now, overall, I've had some direct interaction with every single individual who has been a member of the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang since 1996. And I've carried out formal one-on-one interviews with about half of the total number, as well as repeated interviews with a sub-selection of 20 of these who I interview every time I go back to Nicaragua in order to follow their life trajectories. Now, to these should also be added hundreds of hours of informal conversations, both individually and in group, and not only with gang members, but also with local inhabitants. And I'm also in regular communication with both gang members and non-gang members in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández. Initially, so when I'm not in Nicaragua, so initially this was by sporadic phone calls. There were only 12 phone lines in the neighborhood in the mid-1990s. Now, of course, everybody has mobile phones. So communication in some ways now becomes overwhelming, and you have to kind of, I mean, WhatsApp is evil. It's very complicated to kind of put limits on fieldwork, which is also something that is quite important to do. But perhaps what's most interesting is the longitudinal nature of my research has allowed for a chronological reflexivity and the periodic reassessment of events and information obtained previously. Perhaps one of the most interesting elements of doing research on a repeated basis like this is the extent you realize how much an ethnographer effectively is a bit of a village idiot. And you think you understand what you're doing. You think you understand, and then things get revealed to you that you may have not understood things properly. And so the longitudinal research does allow for a kind of almost auto-corrective element to the research that you do. Now, the location of my research, Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, was originally founded as an illegal squatter settlement by rural urban migrants in the early 1960s. It was one of many such informal settlements in Managua at the time. Due to its inhabitants' extreme poverty, the settlement was initially known as La Sobrevivencia, survival. But it was rebuilt during the early 1980s in the context of the revolutionary Sandinista state's housing development program. Although socioeconomically, it remained in the lowest quartile of Managua neighbourhood. Now, the settlement has always been infamous for crime, but became notorious in the post-revolutionary period due to the emergence of a very brutal local gang. Now, this bad reputation has persisted into the present, although the gang has changed significantly over the past 2 decades. Now, the evolution of the Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang during the post-revolutionary period broadly reflects a general trajectory of Nicaraguan gang dynamics and can be divided into 7 phases. Effectively, an emergence phase in the late 80s to about 92, the golden era phase, and that's the term that gang members themselves use, La Edad de Oro, from 93 to about 98, a drug dealing phase around 99 to 2005, a phase which I call a pacified phase from 2006 to 2011, then a revival phase, a combo phase, and finally a post-April 2018 phase. And I'll explain these phases a little bit one by one. But what has to be said is that the socioeconomic background of gang members has not changed significantly across these different phases, and nor has their gender, except in the combo phase. Except in that combo phase, all gang members were male. The gang structure has evolved over time, both in terms of its size and its organization. I mean, at its smallest, the gang had 6 members. At its largest, it had 100. And the spread and median age of members has also fluctuated across phases, with, for example, the spread of age of members being from 7 to 26 years old, while the median age has varied between 15 and 24 years old. Beyond these kinds of mutations, however, it's the way that the different phases of the Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang evolution can each be associated with distinct types of governance, and more specifically, distinct types of individual and collective forms of violence and capital accumulation that is most significant, in my opinion. So, let me talk a little bit about the emergent phase. This was the kind of first immediate post-war gang. Its core was 8 youth, aged 18 to 20, who were former Sandinista Popular Army conscripts who'd been demobilized more or less simultaneously in 1989. There were 4 slightly older youth who'd also been conscripts and who were between the ages of 20 and 23. Now, these came together and they engaged regularly in a range of violent activities, including beating up any individual who had robbed, attacked, or threatened their friends or families, which was something that happened quite frequently in the post-war context of heightened uncertainty and insecurity that characterized Nicaragua in the early 1990s. Now, the impulse for this particular pattern of vigilante violence was clearly related to the ex-conscript nature of the gang members. These systematically mention 3 basic reasons for joining and for forming a gang. First, that the change of regime in 1990 from a revolutionary to a non-revolutionary regime had led to a very abrupt devaluation of their social status, which as conscripts defending the revolution had been very high, both generally and within the local community. And so becoming gang members had seemed a way to reaffirm themselves vis-a-vis a society which kind of tended to seem to forget them quite quickly. There was also definitely an element of them missing the kind of dramatic and adrenaline-fueled experiences of violence and danger and war. And then, perhaps most importantly, though, gang members had also seen, becoming gang members had seemed to many of these individuals a natural continuation of their previous role as soldiers. It was very much about protecting people. It was about kind of serving a community. And so, in some ways, they felt that by becoming gang members, they could have become almost local pseudo-army. At the same time, the gang also socialized together and very quickly ended up regularly fighting other gangs at popular local nightclubs and bars on Friday and Saturday nights, for example, for reasons unrelated to the vigilante ethos and much more to the consequences of drinking and macho posturing. These fights, more often than not, included fist fights and broken bottles, but would sometimes escalate to firearms, although when they did, these encounters became highly mythologized. Thank you. I'll get there. Now, while many of these fights, these kind of gang conflicts at nightclubs, were kind of perceived as collective fights, in actual fact, they were much more individual one-on-one fights, very much along the very ritualized lines of briga conflict in Brazil, famously described by the anthropologist Daniel Turo Linga. So what you have here is you have a kind of group of conscripts who engage in a collective violence, which is very much drawing on their military capital, and then individual violence, which is linked to kind of more identity and machismo. The golden era kind of gang effectively represents a period when, after the first generation of gang members matured out of the gang. One thing that should be said about gang membership is that in most of the world, it's generally a finite social role. In most of the world, gang members go through a gang and then will leave the gang and do something else. There is a variety of reasons why that might happen. But obviously, generational transformations, when they occur, can significantly impact on the nature and the way a gang operates and is. And in the case of the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang, we saw a whole wave of new members who had no military background or significant experiences of Sandinismo. Yet at the same time, the vigilante norms and practices of the previous gang members continued and were in fact institutionalized. And part of the reason for this is that rather than being based on gang members' personal experience of having defended the nation or the revolution, the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang vigilante impulse became linked to a local contextual sense of belonging to the neighborhood. It's something that is linked to the shrinking of the collective social imaginary in post-revolutionary Nicaragua that has been described brilliantly by the Nicaraguan Jesuit sociologist Juan Carlos Núñez, who talks about the way in which post-revolutionary Nicaragua saw an ontological shift from the nation to the neighborhood. And in that sense, people's kind of reference point became the neighborhood, and therefore, in some way, the gang, that kind of allowed the institutionalization of certain processes in the gang. So a gang whose members had previously had a vigilante ethos from the experience of defending the nation, suddenly developed or institutionalized a vigilante ethos in terms of defending the neighborhood. Now, this affected the violent practices of the gangs in a variety of different ways. The first gang's vigilante violence had been rather ad hoc in nature. If somebody threatened their families or friends, they would hunt them down and beat them up or kill them. In the mid-1990s, in the golden era, the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang displayed much more territorial dynamics. So it was less about individual kind of threats, and it was more about protecting the territory. Gang members strategically placed themselves around the neighborhood in order to kind of, as lookouts. They would also patrol the neighborhood to make sure that nobody from outside the neighborhood could come in. Much of the gang's violence now revolved around semi-ritualized forms of gang warfare that obeyed a number of precise rules and practices. And I'm not going to go into these now, but suffice to say that basically gang wars were not anarchic. They followed very precise rules. And although they could have very negative effects, these kind of rituals, in some ways, provided a framework of predictability for people. So you knew that if there was a conflict between two gangs, the first kind of battle would involve sticks and stones. Then there'd be an escalation process. The next one might involve knives and broken bottles. Then the next one would involve mortars and guns, and then it would end up with AK-47s and fragmentation grenades. Although the speed at which this occurred could vary, the sequence never varied. So it basically meant that you knew if there had been a fight with sticks and stones, that you would do well to stay at home and to be careful, because there were likely to be bullets flying within a few days at most. And this in a context of extreme insecurity, of heightened uncertainty, that modicum of predictability was something which was very much appreciated by kind of local inhabitants who actually talked very positively about the gang. And to the extent that they often would take up a word, I mean, when I talked to gang members about why they did this, why they engaged in this kind of ritualized violence, they justified it as because they loved the neighborhood. They used the word querer to talk about loving the neighborhood. And neighborhood inhabitants use the same word to describe the gang as queriendo el barrio and cuidando el barrio. Other elements kind of pointing to the kind of territorial identification was that during this golden era, the gang gave itself a name, which was Los Sobrevivientes, in reference to the kind of old barrio's name. So there was a new logic in this era, one that aimed at imposing a form of territorial order rather than just protecting families and friends. Now, during this golden era phase, the police, which have not been at all present in the early 90s, began to make occasional incursions in the neighborhood, leading to kind of violent kind of confrontations with the gang. These were relatively rare. I mean, they was mainly after national mayoral elections when the president or the mayor needed to start off their term with a bang, so to speak. And so they would temporarily grant the police with means to buy gasoline and ammunition. And when those means ran out, the police no longer came. Now, the dynamics of gangs in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández changed dramatically at the turn of the century due to the arrival of cocaine, mainly in the form of crack. Now, on the one hand, this was because crack is a very nasty drug, and it makes individual users very aggressive. And gang members got hooked on crack and therefore started becoming quite aggressive with people in order to be able to buy their next fix. But on the other hand, and perhaps more sociologically interesting, the kind of gang moved from displaying a sense of solidarity with the local community to becoming a more predatory organization because it became actively involved in drug dealing as street dealers, but also collectively as a security apparatus for the emergent drugs trade. And so contrarily to the past, when the gang sought to control the territory of the neighborhood, it now aimed to control the population. It kind of imposed a climate of terror and fear, which was aimed at making sure that the drugs trade could operate unimpeded. And in many ways, you could say that it violently underpinned the process of very exclusive, primitive accumulation that enabled a small group of dealers to make it good within a broader context of poverty and limited opportunities for capital accumulation. Now, another new trend that emerged during this period was that the police began to implement what might be termed a policy of spectacular policing, regularly entering poor neighborhoods in an arbitrary and intimidating manner, heavily armed, wearing riot gear, and more often than not, specifically targeting youth. Now, this new policing was linked to the fact that the violence of the drug trade had begun to spill beyond poor neighborhoods and started impacting on middle-class neighborhoods. It was very much a kind of reaction to try and keep the violence within the neighborhood. And it's something that kind of also happened in tandem with a widespread process of infrastructural transformation of Managua, which aimed at kind of with disembedding the kind of areas of the rich from the rest of the city to kind of securitize them and become an almost fortified network. Now, this new form of policing had a dual consequence. On the one hand, it led to violent exchanges between the police and the local gang, but it also led to increasing engagement between the police and drug dealers. And while this engagement was initially confrontational, it became very accommodating after a while, to the extent that within a few years, you could say that there was a systematized system of collusion that had emerged between the police and drug dealing in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández. And it's something which began to kind of develop more systematically at a national level. And one of the things about the drug trade in Nicaragua, I mean, Nicaragua is a perfect narco state. The drugs trade has been nationalized and is controlled by the central Nicaraguan state. So that's another story. Now, partly as a result of this systematic collusion between the authorities and drug dealers, the Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang underwent a pacification phase from about mid-2006 onwards. Now, the local drugs trade in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández had initially been organized in a very ad hoc manner. It was one individual who kind of brought drugs over from the Caribbean coast, which initially was being fished out of the water by his relatives. As he kind of developed systematized links with the police and started needing more resources in order to control the police, he also kind of came into more systematic contact with Colombian cartels on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, and effectively professionalized his activity. And by early 2006, drug dealing in Luis Fanor Hernández was principally associated with a shadowy group who involved both youth and adults, not all of whom were ex or current gang members, and moreover, not all of whom came from the neighborhood. People didn't know really who this group was, or who most of the members of this group were, but they referred to it as the cartelito, or the little cartel. Now, partly because crack consumption made gang members unreliable, but also because of their fundamentally amateur nature as a kind of drug dealers and a security apparatus, the cartelito began to systematically exclude the gang from dealing. I won't go through the kind of history of the conflict, but basically this led to a kind of a big deflagration where the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang at the time tried to attack the house of the major drug dealer, the leader of the cartelito. It didn't go very well for the gang, who were effectively, well, several of them were killed and executed in broad daylight. And the gang basically ceased to exist as a collective unit. All the more so as the cartelito, following that event, sought to consolidate its domination of the neighborhood by patrolling and making sure that no group of more than 2 youth could be seen together. If there were more than 2 youth, we'd have people on motorcycles going by and taking pot shots in order to intimidate the youth. And this was part of a kind of more general kind of approach by the cartelito to kind of really kind of clamp down completely on the barrio, which they wanted to control completely. And it was between the period of 2007 to 2011 that you probably had the highest levels of insecurity in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, where you really did not know who you could trust, and a lot of people, when you saw strangers in the street, you just kind of avoided them as much as possible. There were lots of kind of these mythological stories, 2 brothers getting drunk together, and one kind of criticizing the cartelito, the other one pulling out a gun and killing the brother because he was a member of the cartelito. Never proven, but the fact that these stories circulated gives you a sense of the way in which kind of terror works. Now, most members of the cartelito were arrested in 2011, reportedly because a rival cartelito who had developed links to certain members of the Nicaraguan government was able to supersede the bribes that the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández cartelito regularly paid to the police to be left alone. Now, this development allowed for the emergence of a new youth gang in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández as early as 2012, when a group of 12, 14 to 15-year-olds began hanging out together as a group on neighborhood street corners. Now, they were all involved individually in a variety of petty criminal activities, and although most local inhabitants could consider them more or less innocuous, as their violence and delinquency was generally low level, and they didn't carry out most of them in the neighborhood, although not because they loved the neighborhood, but mainly because they weren't anonymous enough, and they weren't powerful enough to kind of avoid being beaten up by kind of adults. What happened? There was one episode which happened where the gang mistakenly attacked a grandmother, beat her up, which was not done, and former gang members basically rounded them up, put them in the park, and then asked me to give them a seminar about how to be a proper gang, which I did. I gave them a history of the gang and so on, and how you love the neighborhood and so on and so forth. One of the unintentional consequences of that seminar is that this new gang, which until then had really been involved mainly in kind of individual forms of violence and had otherwise hung out to smoke weed or drink, decided to engage in collective violence and attacked another neighborhood. Although they weren't very successful at it, several of them got badly injured and so on, This was something which was very much, which excited people in the neighborhood. One inhabitant called Doña Yolanda, for example, in an interview just after the event, kind of very excited, said, "Oh, the gang is back! The gang is back!" And so there was there's a kind of sense that this gang was beginning to kind of reproduce some of this kind of community identity, territorial kind of entity, kind of becoming once again a reference point, and kind of ontological reference point for a sense of identity in the neighborhood. The thing is that these gangs were quite ephemeral. They would last only, they had a high member turnover, and they would last 6 months to a year, and then kind of a new group would emerge, and so on. Very similar to the previous group, but different. And in this sense, you saw kind of a very low-level gang. They kind of correspond in many ways to the kind of classic street corner gang that you find in what described in works by Frederick Thrasher or William White, for example, in the US. But even at this low level, gangs rapidly became perceived by the Nicaraguan authorities as social nuisance, particularly as the government was very much trying to promote a discourse that Nicaragua was crime-free and safe in order to attract retirement tourism and foreign direct investment. And so the rise of these kind of gangs led to a very kind of a new form of policing, particularly in Managua, where poor neighborhoods came to be patrolled by a new purposefully created police unit known as Los Dantos. Los Dantos were heavily armed, motorized units dressed in anonymous black uniforms. From about 2015 onwards, began to engage in a targeted national campaign of intimidation against urban youth, indiscriminately stopping and searching, beating, and sometimes imprisoning both gang members and non-gang members. In barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, what began to happen, we'd have these collective patrols of 20 motorcycles descend on the neighborhood. You'd have a driver and the passenger would have a shotgun or an AK-47. And they would start corralling male youth, who they would then strip search, confiscate any money and mobile phone, arrest people with drugs, and then they would arbitrarily load 1 or 2 individuals into pickup trucks and drive to the other side of Managua and dump them naked there, which obviously within a context of very macho Nicaragua was a very effective way of actually intimidating and keeping young men off the streets. Now, this kind of new form of policing successfully stymied the spread of male gangs, both in barrio Luis Fanor Hernández and more widely, but had the unintentional consequence of leading to the unprecedented emergence of female gangs. Known locally as combos, a term that seems to have been borrowed from a Colombian telenovela shown on Nicaraguan TV, these female gangs have very different dynamics to the male gangs of the previous eras. In barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, the first combo came to the fore in late 2015 and was made up of 15 young women, aged between 16 and 21, who'd all been to the same local school and who were interacting via Facebook. Although they would also come together in person regularly to party every Saturday at neighborhood fiestas or nightclubs. And at these kind of fiestas and nightclubs, individual cumberas would get into fights with other young women who were often members of other combos for reasons linked to macho pride. Now, one whom I interviewed said, "Oh, I saw a girl dissing me, and when I went over to ask her what her problem was, she started mouthing off, so I got angry and I challenged her to a fight." But most frequently, it was about young men. She was dancing with a guy I liked, so I went up to him and told him that he should be with me, not with her, but she was ugly. So she got angry and challenged me to a fight. Now, these fights were one-on-one encounters, but were extremely violent. I mean, when I was there in November 2016, a 17-year-old girl was killed by another outside a nightclub. Although most of the time they stopped when one of the combatants was seriously injured or kind of ran away or asked for mercy. Now, these conflicts are also then prolonged on social media, which kind of led to kind of, well, social media was semi-public as well, and therefore there was a huge following. And you had cumberas who kind of had huge social media following and become very popular, and it was also a way of, so you'd have kind of the prolongation of the physical violence and kind of social media violence. Now, this particular pattern of the IHEID, kind of emergence of female gangs, can be directly related to the Dantos police tactics vis-a-vis young males. The absence of males in the street was striking in 2016, certainly compared to my visits in 2012 and 2014. And several youths, both male and female, explained to me how the way that the Dantos policing of young males in the street had very much upset the local sexual economy. Previously, young men and women had met each other and flirted on the street before then pairing off to court semi-privately in neighborhood parks, squares, and patios. Now, by 2016, this had ceased almost entirely as a result of the police repression. And the main space for flirtation and courtship between young men and young women in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández were a couple of local nightclubs and the occasional neighborhood fiesta. Now, the dynamics there, the social dynamics, the dynamics of social interaction were completely different from the ones that you had on the street. You know, these are eminently collective, public, heated, loud, and hugely performative spaces, characterized by strutting, by preening, and aggressive dance-offs, and so on. Now, the sense of competition is extreme, and as a cumbera called Olga told me, girls who have developed reputations for being good fighters have a better chance of getting the boys they want without being challenged by other women. And she argued that the whole logic of the combo was about getting a man. And it's true that young women would retire from the combo as comberas once they had obtained a man. As Olga put it, now I've got my husband. I've distanced myself from the combo. I don't involve myself like I used to. Now, the final phase I'll describe is the post-April 2018 phase. So in April 2018, Nicaragua was the stage of a mass popular uprising against the current government. Now only revolutionary in name, representing very much an oligarchy rather than the full majority of the population, the Sandinista regime led by Daniel Ortega that returned to power in 2007 had become increasingly unpopular over the previous years, with the end of Venezuelan aid following the death of Hugo Chavez, which undermined the social redistribution program that had underpinned the clientelistic political system of Sandinismo 2.0. This was replaced by increasing repression and social control in a broader context of increasing levels of impoverishment, rising inequality, and fiscal imbalance. And the government's attempt to implement huge pension cuts and tax increases were the spark that led to mass demonstration across the country. Government was caught completely unprepared and very violently repressed the protests, instituting a reign of fear and terror through arbitrary acts of violence and the imposition of curfews in poor neighborhoods. Over 300 people were killed, hundreds more were disappeared, thousands arrested, while over 80,000 Nicaraguans fled across the border to Costa Rica. Now, this is a process that took place over several months and involved the police as well as what were termed parapoliciales, or parapolice. That is to say, armed groups of civilians who were deputized by the police. Now, these events arguably marked a new phase in Nicaragua's gang history. On the one hand, just as in the case of gangs in the late 70s and the 80s during the original Sandinista revolutionary insurrection, the gangs disappeared because of the more violent actor on the streets. At the same time, many of the people recruited as parapoliciales were former gang members. Now, the recruitment of gang members by the Sandinista government to kind of repress or disrupt opposition is not new. This has been happening for a while, and it responds to a clear logic of recruiting violence experts. But it occurred in the post-April 2018 phase. It occurred in a much kind of larger scale than previously, with the number of parapoliciales estimated to be around 10,000 in total, and at least a third to perhaps 40% of these former gang members, as well as military veterans, former policemen, and Sandinista party. Now, this included at least two individuals in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández, whom I interviewed in February 2020. One was a gang member from the early 2000s, the other a gang member from the early 2010s. Both were recruited through the Sandinista Party's youth organization in late 2018 and early 2019, and were provided with weapons and each paid 300 cordobas, approximately $10 a day, to regularly enter into other neighborhoods at night and randomly shoot to intimidate people whilst screaming Sandinista slogans. As the government was used its foreign reserves to pay these people, they ran out, and so the government instead then started offering immunity from prosecution to individuals, which then led to a massive spiraling of delinquency and crime. Now, what are we to make of this trajectory? I mean, the overarching trajectory of the gang in Barrio Luis Fanor Hernández is one of a transformation from a vigilante gang organized around ex-conscripts in the immediate post-war period in the early 1990s, to an institutionalization of this vigilante ethos around local territorial identity concerns in the mid-1990s, to a predatory drug dealing gang in the early 2000s, to the elimination of the gang as a result of the professionalization of the drug trade and the rise of the more powerful actor in the form of the cartelito in the late 2000s, to the organic re-emergence of street corner gangs in the early 2010s, following the fall of the capitalistas, to their repression due to the new forms of policing in the mid-1990s and replacement by deterritorialized female gangs, and to the rise of what you could call is a more national regime of gang rule. Now, a narrow reading of this trajectory might dwell on the fact that there are clear breaks in the gang's institutional continuity. And so you could actually argue this is not a single gang, that there are, and so on. At the same time, if you take the perspective of the gang's social ordering function, the different iterations can arguably be seen as belonging to a single social field. Now, I take the notion of social field from Bourdieu, who uses it to refer to the existence of an arena within which certain kinds of social processes play out according to certain rules and regulations. And so, even if you have different institutional actors within it, you could argue that if they are part of the same social field, perhaps we are talking about a single kind of phenomena, or a more singular phenomenon, and we should actually look at what are the commonalities between them rather than the kind of differences. So, in other words, a social phenomena that we might deem to constitute a gang at a particular moment in time, in a particular context, might be replaced as a gang by a different phenomena, or that same phenomena may morph into something different to a gang, but staying within the same social field and with the same social function. So in this respect, the overview of the evolution of the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang that I presented clearly suggests that two issues are potentially important to take into account when thinking about how different iterations of an institution we can call a gang occupy the gang social field. First of all, each iteration of the gang can be associated with distinct types of violence, instrumentally related to different purposes. And then the forms of violence associated with the gang are both individual and collective. And they can be associated with different regimes of capital accumulation. And Bourdieu has pointed out that capital constitutes the most basic building block of processes of social reproduction. But there exist different forms of capital. He identifies three basic ones: economic, social, and cultural. And economic is about material resources, social capital is linked to kind of social relations, and cultural relates to individuals' knowledge and skills acquired through educational social status and so on. But at the same time, importantly within Bourdieu's thinking, capital is both individual and collective, as an individual deploys their capital, but it has to be, the capital accumulation has to be collectively validated. And so different types of capital are accumulated by different social agents within a social field in different ways. And Bourdieu had the whole theory about how different forms of capital can be converted and transferred from one field to another, which enables processes of social reproduction of particular processes, even if institutions might change. Now, building on Bourdieu's ideas around capital, as well as kind of four more precise forms of cultural capital, which are warrior capital, which is actually developed by the French sociologist Thomas Sauvadet around gangs in Marseille and Paris, sexual capital, identity capital, and security capital. I want to suggest that we can actually see an interesting evolution, and this is the table I was telling you about, in the way in which in the way that the kind of gang has changed over time. And it's one where I think we can actually start identifying some interesting repetitions as well as kind of points of disjunction. Now, the different iterations of the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang arguably deployed violence in different ways at different points in time to facilitate the accumulation of different types of capital. The emergent phase iteration of the gang was involved in forms of collective vigilantism in favor of gang members' friends and families, and some group fighting at nightclubs, as well as forms of individual one-on-one fighting and delinquency. The latter was associated, or can be associated, with the accumulation of warrior capital, a notion, which is the idea that you are a big warrior, you kind of have got an expertise in being violent. While the former can be associated with social capital, a weak form of identity capital, and a limited form of security capital. Identity capital is kind of a sense of belonging to a kind of global community, and that the security capital is about kind of predictability within the context of climate. By the golden era phase, though, this security capital concerned protecting the whole neighborhood community and not just friends and family. At the same time, though, the gang's collective forms of ritualized inter-gang warfare had become a generalized mode of accumulation of identity capital that had an effect beyond the gang, as the fact that it was common to hear local inhabitants express "la pandilla es el barrio," the gang is the neighborhood, highlights very well. The gang also engaged in forms of individual and collective forms of delinquency, which were associated with worried economic capital accumulation, although economic capital accumulation was a bit disorganized in this phase. It was not really a systematic form of drug dealing, for example. It's more kind of individual kind of delinquency or so on. During the drug dealing phase, the gang was involved in more instrumental forms of violence, both collectively and individually, which aimed at systematically accumulating economic capital, as well as accumulating security capital, although in a different manner to the previous phase. In particular, where the previous mode of security capital accumulation had been based on providing local inhabitants with a modicum of personal safety, the drug dealing gang's mode of security capital accumulation was more limited in scope, based on the perpetration of a climate of fear and terror in the neighborhood to enable the drugs trade to operate. There's no gang in the pacification phase, and I've deliberately, for simplification, not tried to include the Capitalito in this, although one could, because it also was involved in certain forms of accumulation. In many ways, you could argue it's just a more institutionalized version of the drug dealing forms of capital. The revival phase gang engaged in spontaneous inter-gang conflict as well as individual delinquency, aimed at accumulating economic and warrior capital individually and collective social capital at the peer group level. And so on and so forth. You can see that the combo phase also engaged in certain ritualized forms of individual violence as well as individual and collective violence and so on. And the post-April 2018 phase of gangsterism saw kind of former gang members engaged in individual forms of violence in order to facilitate the accumulation of a collective form of security capital by the government. Now, the fact that we can observe here some repetition of different forms of violence and capital accumulation across different phases of the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández gang's evolution is not surprising. While gangs are highly variable social institutions, part of what makes their different iterations all gangs are common activities and behaviors, and so it's not unexpected that there are similarities between phases. Similarly, the particular nature of certain forms of capital, such as warrior capital, means that their accumulation must necessarily involve individual violence, and could explain the repeated correlation between the latter form of violence, although in different varieties, and the former type of capital accumulation across phases. But how do we understand the move from one form of violence to another, or the different forms of capital accumulation they relate to? What triggers the transformation of the gang from one phase to another? Several trends can be identified regarding the articulation of specific forms of violence and specific types of capital accumulation across phases. While there are a number of clear continuities regarding both individual and collective forms of violence across phases, there only exists similar continuity between individualized forms of capital accumulation. Collective forms of capital accumulation consistently change across phases. And this can be explained by the fact that individualized forms of capital accumulation respond to endogenous dynamics, whether internal to the gang or to the neighborhood, while collective forms of capital accumulation seem to respond primarily to factors which are exogenous. Certainly, if you look at the shifts in the forms of collective capital accumulation associated with different phases of the gang development, they can all be related to external processes. The move from the golden era to the drug dealing phase was precipitated by the arrival of cocaine. The change from the revival to the combo phase can be connected to the transformation of police patterns, which is shift, and the shift from the combo to the post-April 2018 phase was precipitated by national politics. The fact that exogenous factors provoke fundamental shifts in the regime of collective capital accumulation from one iteration of the gang to another can also be linked to the way that the gang, as a field of violent capital accumulation, relates to other local violent actors. There seems to be a clear process at work here, insofar as the gang's transformation in its first three phases is one of increasing hegemonic domination over the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández territory and community. But the next phases see the gang dominated by more violent external actors. The exogenous introduction of drugs led to the emergence of a new actor, the cartelito, which sought and achieved a monopoly over violence, thereby excluding the gang from the social field. The fall of the cartelito opened up a space for the gang to re-emerge again in the revival phase, but in a form that struggled to establish any local hegemony and had to face very rapidly a new violent exogenous actor in the form of Los Dantos before it was able to institutionalize in any meaningful way. And the rise of the combos, in fact, is in many ways a testament to the lack of institutionalization, because sociologically speaking, you could say that the combos constitute an attempt to create an alternative gang that could circumvent police hegemony by existing in a virtual space. And while the gang members' induction into the government's repressive apparatus following the April 2018 uprising arguably marks their demise as an autonomous social phenomena in the face of overwhelming domination by the state, you could just argue that actually this is a situation where the state has become a gang. So in some ways, the gangs have won in Nicaragua and become the model for governance. So while the barrio Luis Fanor Hernández's gang's evolution might not be systematic in nature, it clearly involves numerous contingent elements. It also contains a number of recurrent events that come to the fore repeatedly. Certain forms of individual violence and capital accumulation articulate in particular ways on a regular basis, partly due to the inherent nature of the capital being accumulated, the warrior capital, which is individual, but also because past practices clearly offer templates for individual gang members. When there are systematic correlations between collective forms of violence and capital accumulation, this tends to be due to endogenously driven processes of institutionalization, as occur between the first and second phase of the gang's evolution. The disjunctive shifts in patterns of violence and accumulation, for example, between the golden era and the drug dealing phase, were precipitated by exogenous factors, the arrival of cocaine. So, while these different transformations are quite easy to understand in general terms, you know, the gang's transformation in the drug dealing phase makes economic sense, for example, while it is logical that the rise of a hegemonic and non-monopolistic local violent actor, other than the gang, might lead to the transformation of the gang as a social field of capital accumulation. What's more difficult to understand is specific features of the different iterations. For example, why did the move from the gang's revival phase, to the combo phase involve the rise of a female gang? This is particularly puzzling because there is a lack of past reference points relating to female gang participation in Nicaragua. And it's one of the things that I'm trying to kind of find out, particularly through interviewing on a repeated basis former cumberas to try and get a better sense of why did they join the gang, what motivated them, and what were the templates they used. But so far it's been quite, it hasn't really, nothing really has emerged except for, well, TV, and because the idea that they saw certain, there was a series on TV which had quite a paradigmatic female gang members, and one of them, also at the same time another TV series, La Reina del Sur, about a female drug dealer, also seemed to have had quite a lot of impact. But it is a bit disturbing to think that, you know, that a whole shift in the nature of a gang can be linked to TV. I mean, I know we all think TV is evil, but still. Yet the commonalities that exist across phases between forms of individual capital accumulation, as well as a repeated connection to a particular type of violence, do suggest that there is some systematicity across a gang's evolutionary trajectory, albeit perhaps more in terms of episodic recurrence of certain inherent articulations of these forms of violence in capital accumulation, rather than any kind of determined linear progress. So perhaps rather than seeing a linear deterministic, we should look at this perhaps more stochastically. We have certain parameters within which kind of evolutions can occur, and which ones do will be very much determined by contingent and contextual events. So what can perhaps be said in the final analysis about gang dynamics and their transformation is that while the latter is never linear in nature, there are definite relations between actors, violence, and forms of capital accumulation that, when they respond to endogenous dynamics, lead to repetitive outcomes, and when they are affected by exogenous factors, give rise to more unpredictable